Concept 42.5, gas exchange occurs across specialized respiratory surfaces. And when it comes to gas exchange, we're focusing on where oxygen is going and where carbon dioxide is going. And the goal is to take in oxygen from the environment and let go of carbon dioxide, which has been generated within the body, out into the environment. And what is going to drive the exchange of these gases from one location to the next is going to be partial pressure gradients. So when it comes to the discussion of breathing, partial pressure gradients drive gas exchange. And when it comes to partial pressure, we're thinking about pressure exerted by a gas in a mixture of gases. And we'll just reference oxygen and carbon dioxide in all of our discussion of partial pressure gradients for this chapter. But when we think about the type of media that is used in order to facilitate gas exchange, what we find is that air and water are not equal respiratory media, and as a result, organisms will have different mechanisms by which gas exchange can take place. So, for example, as your book says, the density of water is significantly higher than that of air. The viscosity of water is higher than that of air. And so that's going to have an impact on the ease of taking in this respiratory media through the branching that occurs within the respiratory system. When we think about other factors, such as the amount of oxygen that we find within water as compared to air, there's much less of it that is found in the water compared to the air. And so that means that when it comes to respiration for aquatic organisms, there has to be a much higher level of efficiency in order to get as much oxygen as possible. So, in order for gas exchange to take place, there needs to be movement off or across some type of respiratory surface. And we'll go through a few examples of respiratory surfaces. They're going to vary depending on the needs of the organism, the media in which it's acquiring its gases from, and we'll put emphasis as far as our discussion is concerned on gills, the tracheal system, and the lungs. So our take-home message for this image is that there is a ton of diversity when it comes to the structure and organization of gills. And gills serve as a site for gas exchange in aquatic animals. Now, gills are specialized extensions of tissues. They're meant to project into the water, and they can be simple, and there's a simple kind of organization seen in echinoderms. A starfish or a sea star is an example of that, or they can be more complex. Now, when it comes to gills, they help to increase the surface area, and that allows for the organism to extract a lot more oxygen from the water than would be possible from their body surface alone. Now, if you think back to the axolotl from earlier within this chapter, that would have been an example of external gills, so gills that are easy to see protruding from the outside, similar to the marine worm here. And so the gills are not enclosed within the body structure like what you would see if we were to remove the thorax of the crayfish here. Now, there's a disadvantage to that. And the disadvantage to having external gills is that there's a need for constant movement so that the gills can come into contact with fresh water that has high oxygen content. And when you have outward facing gills, they also have the propensity for damaging more easily than those that are connected or protected rather through something like the exoskeleton. Now, when we are looking at this, that's the primary take-home message. So I'm not going to go through much of the detail between A, B, and C other than to appreciate the fact that how the gills are organized, where the gills are located, they deviate from all of these, but the gills all serve the same purpose, which is to help with gas exchange, and they all serve with increased surface area in order for that exchange to take place as efficiently as possible. Here we have a bony fish, and the bony fish utilizes a countercurrent exchange mechanism. And when it comes to this mechanism, it is really beneficial at pulling out as much oxygen as possible from the surrounding environment. Now, when it comes to the fish, it has gills, and the gills are housed within the oral cavity. So within the mouth is where we'll find those gills. And the cavity can expand. And through that expansion, it allows for water to move into the mouth, through the gills, and out of the fish. And it will move out of the fish through the gill cover, which is the operculum here. Now, when it comes to the gills, there are several gill arches, and they're found on each side of the fish's head. And each gill arch has gill filaments, which have thin membranous plates. These thin membranous plates are called lamella. And when it comes to each lamella, the blood flow is going to oppose the direction of water movement. So that's the countercurrent aspect. So this countercurrent exchange maximizes the oxygenation of blood, and it does that by maintaining a positive oxygen gradient along the entire pathway. Okay, and we can see that quantitatively down here. Now, what that is essentially saying, and if we're thinking about blood flow, on the blue side it's oxygen poor, and then we're heading towards oxygen rich, so towards the red side. When it comes to that blood flow, blood is always less saturated with oxygen than the water it meets. So quantitatively, that means that these values are always going to be lower than the values shown directly above it. Because blood is always less saturated with oxygen than the water that is flowing near it, every single time it comes into close proximity to these values, oxygen is going to diffuse along the lamella. Okay, so it's going to say, well, this is 30, down here is 20. I'm going to diffuse down my partial pressure gradient into the blood. And even when that value increases, because it received some oxygen from the water, this value is still going to be lower than the water at the new position. So we're going to continuously promote net diffusion of oxygen into the blood. And this helps to ensure that even when the oxygen concentration goes up in the blood, there is still more and more oxygen that gets dropped off. And that ensures that the blood leaving the gills has nearly as high an oxygen content as the water that entered it. So this is a really efficient mechanism, and that is driven by the fact that the blood flow and water flow are opposing one another. Here we're showing the tracheal system that's seen in insects, and we are utilizing the grasshopper as an example. Now, the tracheal system is composed of small branched air ducts, or trachea, and the trachea will branch even further into tracheoles. And then these tubes will transmit gases throughout the body, and the tracheoles are in direct contact with the individual cells, which allows for oxygen to diffuse directly across the plasma membrane, as well as carbon dioxide to move in the opposite direction. Now, air passes into the trachea through specialized openings on the exoskeleton. That's referred to here as the external openings, or spiracles, which are the scientific term for that. Now, due to the direct interaction of the tracheoles with the body cells, the grasshopper is not going to depend on the open circulatory system in order for this particular exchange of gases to take place. Here we have the mammalian respiratory system, and the principal organs include the nose, housed within the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, trachea, and bronchi, right? And of course the lungs. Now there is the thoracic cavity in which these events are going to take place. So I'm going to reference the thoracic cavity as we continue our discussions. Now, when we are thinking about the respiratory system, there's a little bit of form and function to consider as well as just the overall roles. Okay, so when we're thinking about the nasal cavity, this is going to be the conduit for air. So it's going to allow us to take air in and breathe air out. It helps to warm air, moisten air, helps with filtration, amongst other things. The pharynx is essentially a space. And what we'll focus on is the pharynx overall, because the pharynx can be broken down into the region proximal to the nose, into the mouth, into the throat. But in general, this is merely a conduit for air. So it's allowing for air to pass through. And we're just going to focus on it as it pertains to the respiratory system. The larynx is, and you see in parentheses, the esophagus, but it's also going to help with, the proper routing for food as well as air. It helps with production of sound. We won't get into that in much detail, but it helps with warming, moistening the air, and essentially protecting the airways. Now, the trachea would be a great example of form and function. It has these C cartilage-based rings that are here. They're really firm, and this really helps to support the air that flows through, because if it was easy to collapse, that would really impact our ability to take in air and let air out effectively. So when we're saying conduit for air, we're just saying pathways, right? So pathways through which air can travel through. And the same thing when we get to the bronchus singular, and then the idea that they're going to branch out into smaller areas, the bronchioles. And so these are still allowing for air to flow through. Okay, so the idea of the mammalian respiratory system is we have all of these passageways or conduits for air to travel. There's ways in which we can modify that air to a certain extent through various portions of the respiratory system. And then ultimately, where that air is going to lead us is to sites of gas exchange within our bodies. So we're taking in all of this air, we're breathing out air. But again, what really matters is the opportunity to exchange gases. We want to drop off what we don't need and pick up what we do need. And when it comes to the mammalian respiratory system, there are two major zones. There's the conducting zone. So in the same way that I was saying, these are conduits or passageways for bringing air through the body or on its way out of the body. There is essentially going to be these conduits up until the bronchiole. The terminal bronchiole will be our kind of last point in which the conduits are found. And then we transition from the conducting zone to the respiratory zone. And the respiratory zone is where gas exchange takes place. So conducting zone, we're thinking about cleaning, humidifying, warming the air. And then the respiratory zone, we're thinking about exchange. And the exchange is going to occur at these alveoli that are found here. These are going to be in close proximity to the cardiovascular system and the pulmonary capillaries, and that's what's going to allow for that exchange to take place. So when we think about that exchange, that ventilation, you are thinking about the close relationship between the vessels within the cardiovascular system and the components of the respiratory system. So we want for there to be an exchange that takes place, and we want to be able to pick up oxygen that we have been taking in, traveling through the conducting zone into the respiratory zone, into the alveolar sacs, and more specifically the alveoli. And then we also want the alveoli to collect the metabolic waste that we were generating through the processes that we needed to in order to sustain our everyday lives. So within this picture, think about what is my line of demarcation in which I transition from the conducting zone to the respiratory zone. Notice now that instead of using the term terminal bronchiole, we now have a respiratory bronchiole, because now we're focusing on that respiration. Think about the term pulmonary, which we associate with lung behavior. And when it comes to the pulmonary venule, this would be oxygen rich. So we know that the direction of movement should be away from the alveolar sac, and the pulmonary arteriole should be heading towards carrying oxygen, poor blood, because we're linking this back to our earlier content. And then when we have purple, should be a site in which we have a mixed content of oxygen. So a little bit less of one and the other, right? So the merging of those two colors is what gives us that purple. And the capillaries provide an opportunity for exchange to occur. So at the capillaries, we should be dropping off the carbon dioxide that was coming through via the pulmonary arteriole. We should be receiving oxygen that is housed within the alveoli, and that's going to help to bring the oxygen content up into the pulmonary venules, and then we'll bring that back to the left-hand side of the heart where we can conduct that oxygen-rich blood now to the rest of the body.